In the quiet hours just before dawn, when the air is still and the world feels suspended between night and morning, it is possible to imagine walking through a place that no longer truly exists. A city without voices, a harbor without ships, fields that were once measured and tended, now returned to grass and silence. History is often told through survival, through monuments preserved, traditions continued, names remembered. Yet much of the human story is shaped by places that did not survive at all. Over the next 2 hours, this journey will move slowly across continents and centuries, visiting civilizations that flourished, organized themselves into complex societies, built cities, cultivated land, traded goods, worshipped their gods, and then, for reasons still debated, disappeared so completely that only fragments remain. We will consider what is known, what is uncertain, and what can only be inferred from traces left behind in soil, stone, and memory. Again and again, historians and archaeologists return to a simple, haunting image, an empty stone doorway standing alone, opening onto nothing but wind and light. It is a reminder that every society, no matter how structured or confident, exists within a delicate balance of environment, economy, belief, and human decision. When that balance shifts, sometimes gradually and sometimes with startling speed, even the most stable civilization can begin to loosen and fade. Long before written records were common, human communities learned to organize themselves around rivers, fertile plains, and reliable trade routes. One of the earliest known examples of a civilization that vanished with remarkable completeness emerged in the Indus River Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Around 2600 BCE, cities such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa displayed an urban sophistication that would not appear in many other parts of the world for centuries. Streets were laid out on orderly grids, houses were constructed with standardized baked bricks, drainage systems carried wastewater away from living areas through covered channels, a level of sanitation that would not be matched in some regions until modern times. At night, if one could stand in Mohenjo-daro at the height of its prosperity, the city would have felt methodical and calm. Workshops for bead-making and metallurgy hummed quietly. Merchants counted weights and measures carefully calibrated to shared standards. Families gathered in courtyards to escape the heat of the day. There were no massive royal tombs or towering palaces that clearly announced a ruling dynasty. Instead, the city suggests a society governed by cooperation and administrative order rather than spectacle. And yet, by around 1900 BCE, this vast network of urban settlements began to decline. The reasons remain uncertain. Geological evidence indicates that river patterns shifted over time, possibly depriving cities of the water sources that had sustained agriculture and trade. Climate records derived from sediment cores suggest that monsoon rains weakened, making farming more difficult. Some historians believe that economic networks connecting the Indus cities to Mesopotamia and Central Asia gradually broke down, reducing the flow of materials and wealth that supported urban life. What is striking is not that the civilization changed, but that it did not leave behind clear written explanations. The script used on seals and tottery remains undeciphered, despite decades of study. Without readable texts, the people of the Indus Valley speak to us only through architecture, artifacts, and the silent geometry of their cities. The empty stone doorway appears here again. The sense of a place prepared for daily life, suddenly left without voices to explain why. As populations dispersed into smaller rural communities, the great urban centers were gradually abandoned. Wind-blown sediment covered streets. Bricks were reused by later inhabitants for new structures elsewhere. Over centuries, the outlines of entire cities softened and sank into the landscape until they were rediscovered in the 20th century by archaeologists who initially mistook the mounds for natural formations. Far to the west, on the Mediterranean island of Crete, another sophisticated society flourished and then receded into myth. The civilization we now call Minoan, named after the legendary king Minos described in later Greek tradition, reached its peak between roughly 2000 and 1450 BCE. Palatial complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia formed the administrative and ceremonial centers of a culture deeply engaged in maritime trade. Their ships carried pottery, textiles, and precious materials across the Aegean Sea, linking Egypt, Anatolia, and mainland Greece. The palace at Knossos was not a fortress in the traditional sense. It lacked heavy defensive walls, suggesting either confidence in naval dominance or a period of relative peace. Its corridors, storerooms, and courtyards created a maze-like arrangement that may have inspired later stories of the labyrinth. Frescoes painted on plaster walls depicted dolphins, lilies, ceremonial processions, and acrobats leaping over bulls in ritual performances. These images convey a society attentive to beauty, movement, and the rhythms of the natural world. But around the mid-2nd millennium BCE, a sequence of disasters appears to have destabilized Minoan life. The volcanic eruption of Thera on the nearby island, now called Santiri, was one of the most powerful in recorded geological history. Ash fell across the region. Tsunamis may have struck coastal settlements. Agricultural patterns were disrupted. Although the eruption alone did not immediately erase Minoan civilization, it likely weakened trade networks and economic stability. Archaeological layers show signs of rebuilding after the eruption, followed by destruction again, possibly from earthquakes, fires, or invasion by Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. Within a few generations, the palaces ceased functioning as centers of power. Administrative systems changed. Shifted from the still undeciphered Linear A script to Linear B, an early form of Greek used by Mycenaean administrators. The cultural continuity of the earlier Minoan world dissolved, leaving behind ruins that later visitors struggled to interpret. If one stands today in the reconstructed corridors of Knossos in the early morning, before tourists arrive, the stillness can feel profound. Painted walls and stone thresholds suggest movement that is no longer there. Another empty stone doorway, opening into a sequence of rooms whose purposes are partly known and partly guessed, reminds us how much can be lost even when structures remain. Across the Atlantic, long before European contact, the Maya civilization developed in the tropical lowlands of present-day Guatemala, Belize, southern Mexico, and Honduras. By the first millennium CE, cities such as Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan had become centers of astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and dynastic history recorded in hieroglyphic inscriptions. The Maya calculated celestial cycles with remarkable precision. They built stepped pyramids aligned with astronomical events. They maintained complex calendars that tracked both ritual time and agricultural seasons. Unlike the Indus script, Maya writing has been largely deciphered, allowing historians to reconstruct political alliances, wars, marriages, and successions across centuries. The inscriptions reveal a landscape of competing city-states, each ruled by divine kings who claimed legitimacy through ancestry and ritual authority. Monumental stelae, carved stone slabs, commemorated accessions to the throne, military victories, and significant calendar dates. Yet between roughly 750 and 900 CE, many of the great cities of the southern lowlands experienced what scholars call the classic Maya collapse. Construction of monuments ceased. Population declined sharply. Palaces and ceremonial centers were abandoned to encroaching forest. The causes appear to be complex and interwoven. Prolonged droughts indicated by lake sediment data, environmental strain from intensive agriculture, internal warfare, shifting trade routes, and possible social unrest. Importantly, the Maya people themselves did not vanish. Millions of their descendants continue to live in the region today, preserving languages and traditions that stretch back to ancient times. What disappeared was the system of urban, monument-building city-states that had defined the classic period. Once again, the empty stone doorway stands not as a symbol of extinction, but of transformation, a threshold between one form of civilization and another. In the high desert of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloan culture, sometimes referred to in older texts as the Anasazi, developed distinctive architectural traditions between approximately 100 and 1300 CE. At sites such as Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, multi-story dwellings were constructed from carefully shaped sandstone blocks and timber beams. Some buildings contained hundreds of rooms arranged around central plazas. Kivas, circular, partially subterranean ceremonial chambers, served as spaces for ritual gatherings and community decision-making. Chaco Canyon, in particular, functioned as a regional hub connected by a network of engineered roads extending across vast distances. The scale of planning required to build and maintain these structures indicates coordinated labor and shared cultural purpose. At night, under a sky dense with stars, the canyon would have held the quiet sounds of communal life, cooking fires, conversation, the measured rhythms of ceremony. By the late 13th century, however, these settlements were largely abandoned. Tree ring analysis shows a period of severe drought that would have made farming unsustainable. As water sources diminished, populations dispersed into smaller communities along rivers and valleys where conditions were more stable. The great stone complexes remained, gradually weathering under sun and wind. Visitors walking through the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde often remark on the sensation of intimacy. Doorways sized for human passage, storage rooms still bearing traces of plaster, handholds carved into stone walls. It is easy to imagine daily routines continuing just beyond sight. The empty stone doorway appears once more, framing a landscape that has outlasted the society that shaped it. Throughout this journey, a pattern begins to emerge. Civilizations rarely vanish in a single moment. More often, they transform, fragment, migrate, or are absorbed into neighboring cultures. What disappears is the particular arrangement of institutions, beliefs, and relationships that once held communities together. Environmental change, economic disruption, disease, warfare, and internal conflict can all contribute, but seldom in isolation. The fading of a civilization is usually the result of many pressures converging over time, gradually making the old ways of living unsustainable. As the first light of morning spreads across the horizon, illuminating ruins scattered across the world, the silence they hold is not empty, but layered. It contains the memory of decisions made by individuals whose names are lost, of seasons of abundance followed by hardship, of adaptations that succeeded and others that did not. To walk among these remnants is to sense continuity as much as loss, the understanding that human societies are always in motion, always responding to forces both visible and unseen. And so the journey continues, moving onward to other places where traces remain but explanations grow faint, where the empty stone doorway stands against the sky as a quiet invitation to consider how even the most intricate civilizations can pass beyond the reach of memory, leaving only the patient work of historians to listen for echoes in the dust. Beyond the river valleys, islands, and forested lowlands already visited, there are regions where entire cultures once shaped the land so thoroughly that their disappearance altered the landscape itself. In the central Pacific Ocean, scattered across a triangle formed by Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand, the ancestors of the Polynesian peoples undertook one of the greatest maritime migrations in human history. Using double-hulled canoes, knowledge of stars, ocean swells, bird flight patterns, and cloud formations, they settled islands separated by thousands of kilometers of open water. Each island became a distinct society, adapted to local conditions, yet connected by shared language roots and cultural traditions. On Rapa Nui, known more widely as Easter Island, settlers arrived around the early 2nd millennium CE, though estimates vary. They found a remote volcanic island with forests of palm trees, seabird colonies, and fertile soil suitable for agriculture. Over generations, they constructed ceremonial platforms called ahu along the coastline and carved nearly 900 monumental stone statues known as moai from volcanic tuff in the quarry at Rano Raraku. These statues, some weighing more than 70 tons, were transported across the island and erected facing inland, perhaps representing deified ancestors watching over their descendants. The labor required to carve, transport, and raise the moai suggests a society capable of organizing large-scale cooperative projects. At night, when the island was still forested, the silhouettes of statues would have been visible against the sky, each marking a community's identity and lineage. The empty stone doorway appears here in another form, the hollow eye sockets of the moai, once fitted with coral and obsidian, gazing toward villages that have long since changed. What vanished was not the people themselves, who continued to live on Rapa Nui, but the monument-building culture that had defined the island for centuries. The statues remain as silent witnesses, their expressions unchanged by the passing of time, their purpose still partly mysterious. In the deserts of Central Asia, another civilization rose along the trade routes that connected China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. The cities of the Tarim Basin, located in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China, flourished between roughly the 1st millennium BCE and the 1st millennium CE. Oasis settlements such as Laolan, Nia, and Khotan thrived on commerce along the Silk Road, the network of caravan routes that carried silk, spices, metals, glassware, and ideas across Eurasia. Laolan, positioned near the now dry Lop Nur Lake, served as a strategic stop for travelers crossing the harsh Taklamakan Desert. Archaeological discoveries include wooden documents written in early scripts, textiles preserved by the arid climate, and the naturally mummified remains of inhabitants buried in desert cemeteries. These mummies, some with remarkably preserved clothing and hair, provide glimpses of a multicultural society influenced by both Eastern and Western traditions. Over time, however, shifting river courses and desertification altered the environment. Water sources that sustained agriculture and caravan traffic dwindled. By around the 4th century CE, Laolan had been abandoned. Sand gradually covered buildings, streets, and irrigation systems until the city disappeared from memory. When explorers rediscovered the site in the early 20th century, they found structures still standing but surrounded by emptiness, an urban space preserved by isolation, yet severed from the living world that once animated it. Walking through the remains of Laolan today requires traversing vast stretches of desert where wind reshapes the dunes constantly. The empty stone doorway is replaced by wooden frames half buried in sand, leading nowhere except into silence. It is a powerful reminder that geography itself can erase civilizations by removing the conditions that made settlement possible. Further south, in the Andean highlands of South America, the Tiwanaku civilization developed near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. Beginning around 500 CE, Tiwanaku became the center of a regional culture known for monumental stone architecture, agricultural innovation, and religious influence that extended across what is now Bolivia, Peru, and northern Chile. The city featured large ceremonial complexes constructed from precisely cut stone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar. The Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single piece of andesite, displays intricate iconography, including a central deity figure surrounded by winged attendants. Raised field agriculture, a technique involving elevated planting platforms separated by water channels, allowed farmers to manage frost and drought conditions effectively in the harsh, high-altitude environment. At its peak, Tiwanaku may have supported tens of thousands of inhabitants and exerted cultural influence over distant communities through trade and shared religious practices. But by around 1000 CE, the city was largely abandoned. Paleoclimate studies suggest that a prolonged drought reduced water levels in Lake Titicaca, undermining agricultural productivity. As food shortages increased, political cohesion likely weakened, leading to migration and decentralization. When later civilizations encountered the ruins, they attributed them to ancient builders whose identities were already forgotten. Massive stone blocks lay scattered across the site, some toppled, others still standing in partial alignment. The empty stone doorway appears again in the form of monumental portals framing the open sky, their original ceremonial significance known only through interpretation. Not all vanished civilizations left monumental architecture behind. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, complex societies developed in forest and savanna environments where buildings were constructed primarily from earth, wood, and other perishable materials. The kingdom of Aksum, centered in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, flourished between approximately 100 and 940 CE as a major trading power linking the Roman world, Arabia, and India. Its capital featured obelisks carved from single pieces of granite, some towering over 20 meters high, marking royal tombs. Aksum adopted Christianity in the 4th century CE, becoming one of the earliest states to do so. Coins minted in gold, silver, and bronze circulated across trade networks, bearing inscriptions in the Ge'ez language. Over time, however, shifts in trade routes, environmental changes affecting agriculture, and political pressures contributed to the kingdom's decline. The center of power moved southward into the Ethiopian highlands, leaving the original capital diminished. Although Aksum did not vanish completely, its cultural legacy continued in later Ethiopian states. The urban prominence it once held faded, and its monumental structures stood in relative isolation for centuries. Travelers described the obelisks rising from the landscape like markers of a forgotten age, their inscriptions readable only to a few scholars. In North America, along the Mississippi River and its tributaries, the Mississippian culture constructed large earthen mounds between roughly 800 and 1600 CE. The city of Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, became the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, with a population that may have reached tens of thousands at its height around 1100 CE. Monk's Mound,
The largest earthwork at the site rises more than 30 meters high and covers an area larger than many pyramids of Egypt. Cahokia's planners align structures with celestial events, including solstices and equinoxes, indicating sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Wooden circles, known as woodhenge, may have functioned as solar calendars. The city served as a political and religious center connected to a network of smaller communities across the region. By the 14th century, however, Cahokia was largely abandoned. Evidence suggests that environmental strain from deforestation, soil depletion, and flooding may have undermined the agricultural base. Social tensions and political fragmentation could also have played roles. When European explorers reached the region centuries later, they encountered Native American groups whose oral traditions preserved only distant memories of the mound-building ancestors.
Today, the grassy slopes of Monk's Mound appear almost natural, blending into the surrounding plain. The empty stone doorway is replaced by a stairway leading upward to a flat summit where structures once stood, offering a view across land that has witnessed cycles of habitation and departure. As the narrative moves gently forward, the recurring image of thresholds, doorways, gateways, portals, and passages continues to link these distant stories. Each represents a transition between presence and absence, between a world filled with human intention and one reclaimed by time. Civilizations do not vanish in the sense of dissolving into nothing. They leave imprints in language, genetics, agriculture, and cultural memory. Yet the specific configurations that once defined them can fade so thoroughly that later generations must reconstruct their existence piece by piece. In the quiet rhythm of this exploration, it becomes clear that disappearance is not always sudden or catastrophic. Often it is gradual, almost imperceptible within a single lifetime. A generation moves away in search of better land. Trade routes shift slightly. A drought lasts a little longer than expected. Ritual practices lose their authority. Buildings fall into disrepair and are not rebuilt. Eventually, the center no longer holds, and what was once a civilization becomes an archaeological site, a place studied rather than inhabited. The wind moving through these places today carries no memory of the languages once spoken there, yet the physical traces endure. They invite reflection on the fragility of complex systems and the resilience of human adaptation. Standing before an empty doorway carved centuries ago, one can imagine the countless ordinary moments that passed through it: greetings at sunrise, goods carried in from the fields, children stepping outside to watch the changing sky. History often records kings and battles, but the true substance of civilization lies in these quiet routines repeated day after day, until, for reasons large or small, they stop. And so the journey continues onward toward other regions where traces of vanished societies lie hidden beneath forests, deserts, and modern cities, waiting patiently for the careful work of discovery to bring their stories back into the light, even if only as echoes carried through time. In the dense tropical forests of Southeast Asia, where humidity softens the edges of stone and roots slowly weave through carved surfaces, the remains of vast urban landscapes lie partially concealed beneath layers of vegetation. For centuries, travelers moving along rivers in Cambodia occasionally glimpsed towers rising above the canopy, their silhouettes resembling lotus buds turned toward the sky. These were fragments of the Khmer Empire, whose capital region at Angkor became one of the largest pre-industrial urban centers in the world between the 9th and 15th centuries.
At its height in the 12th century, Angkor was not a single city, but a network of temples, reservoirs, canals, and residential zones spread across hundreds of square kilometers. The most famous structure, Angkor Wat, was constructed in the early 1100s during the reign of King Suryavarman II as a state temple dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. Its bas-reliefs depict episodes from epics such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata, as well as historical processions of soldiers, courtiers, and attendants. Later rulers shifted religious emphasis toward Buddhism, adapting existing temples rather than abandoning them entirely. What made Angkor remarkable was not only its architecture, but its hydraulic engineering. Massive reservoirs known as barays stored monsoon rains, while an intricate system of canals regulated water flow for agriculture. This infrastructure supported a large population by stabilizing rice production in a region where seasonal variability could otherwise threaten food supply. At night, the surface of the reservoirs would have reflected the stars, creating the impression of an ordered cosmos mirrored on Earth. Yet by the 15th century, the urban core of Angkor had been largely deserted. Scholars point to a combination of factors: repeated warfare with neighboring kingdoms, including the rising power of Ayutthaya in present-day Thailand, internal political shifts that relocated the royal court closer to trade routes along the Mekong River, and environmental challenges. Recent studies using sediment analysis and airborne laser scanning technology, known as LiDAR, suggest prolonged droughts alternating with intense monsoon rains strained the water management system beyond its capacity. Canals silted up, embankments failed, and agricultural productivity declined. Unlike some earlier civilizations, the Khmer state did not vanish completely. Political and cultural continuity persisted in other regions of Cambodia. What disappeared was the dense urban concentration around Angkor, leaving behind temples gradually enveloped by forest. When European explorers encountered the ruins in the 19th century, they described a city reclaimed by nature, where tree roots cascaded over walls and corridors opened into shadowed courtyards. The empty stone doorway appeared here again, framed by twisting roots and filtered sunlight, suggesting both endurance and abandonment. Traveling westward across the Indian Ocean to the eastern coast of Africa, the medieval Swahili city-states once formed a vibrant chain of ports connecting African interior trade with merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and later China. Between roughly 1000 and 1500 CE, cities like Kilwa Kisiwani, Mombasa, Malindi, and Gedi flourished through commerce in gold, ivory, timber, and enslaved people. Coral stone mosques, palaces, and houses lined narrow streets oriented toward the sea. Gedi, now located in present-day Kenya and surrounded by forest, was a walled city with stone residences, wells, and religious buildings, indicating a prosperous Muslim community integrated into the broader Indian Ocean world. Imported ceramics from China and Persia found at the site demonstrate long-distance trade connections. The call to prayer would have once echoed across courtyards, mingling with the sounds of merchants negotiating prices and sailors preparing vessels for departure. By the 17th century, however, Gedi had been abandoned. The reasons remain uncertain. Some historians suggest shifting trade routes reduced the city's economic importance. Others point to possible freshwater shortages or conflicts with neighboring groups. Unlike Kilwa, which remained inhabited longer, Gedi faded quietly, its buildings gradually hidden by encroaching vegetation. When archaeologists cleared the site in the 20th century, they found houses still containing storage niches, courtyards, and decorative plasterwork. Doorways opened into rooms that had not been occupied for centuries. Once more, the recurring image of the empty threshold appeared, a passage designed for daily life, preserved in stillness.
Further north, in what is now southern Turkey, the ancient kingdom of the Hittites dominated much of Anatolia and northern Syria during the 2nd millennium BCE. Their capital at Hattusa, established around 1600 BCE, featured massive defensive walls, ceremonial gates adorned with carved lions and sphinxes, and royal archives containing thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform script. These texts reveal a complex state engaged in diplomacy, warfare, and legal administration, interacting with contemporaneous powers such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. One of the most significant events recorded in both Hittite and Egyptian sources is the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE, fought between the forces of the Hittite king Muwatalli II and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. Although the battle ended inconclusively, it led to one of the earliest known peace treaties, demonstrating the diplomatic sophistication of the era. Around 1200 BCE, however, the Hittite Empire collapsed amid a broader regional upheaval, often referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Archaeological evidence across the eastern Mediterranean indicates widespread destruction of cities, population movements, and disruptions to trade networks. The causes are debated and may include climate change, internal rebellions, invasions by groups sometimes labeled the Sea Peoples, and systemic economic breakdown. Hattusa itself was burned and abandoned. Later populations settled in the region but did not restore the city to its former status. For centuries, the identity of its builders was forgotten until excavations in the early 20th century revealed the extent of Hittite civilization. Today, visitors walk through reconstructed gates and foundations outlining temples and administrative buildings. The empty stone doorway stands within walls that once enclosed a bustling capital, emphasizing how thoroughly a political power can fade from memory. In the rainforests of West Africa, the city of Great Zimbabwe emerged between the 11th and 15th centuries as the center of a powerful kingdom controlling trade in gold and ivory between the interior and the Swahili coast. Its name, derived from a Shona phrase meaning houses of stone, reflects the monumental dry stone architecture constructed without mortar. The great enclosure, with walls rising over 10 meters high and extending for hundreds of meters, demonstrates advanced engineering and social organization. Inside the enclosures, elite residences and ceremonial spaces suggest a hierarchical society led by a ruling class that managed trade networks reaching as far as China, evidenced by imported porcelain fragments found at the site. The city's population may have reached between 10,000 and 20,000 inhabitants at its peak. By the 15th century, however, the center of power shifted northward, possibly due to overgrazing, deforestation, and declining soil fertility affecting agricultural sustainability. Trade routes also changed as new political entities emerged. Great Zimbabwe was gradually abandoned, leaving its stone walls standing amid open savanna. European visitors in later centuries speculated incorrectly about the origins of the ruins, attributing them to foreign builders rather than recognizing them as the work of local ancestors. Modern archaeology has corrected this misconception, affirming the site's place within African history.
The empty stone doorway appears in the curved passages of the enclosures, guiding the eye toward spaces once filled with ceremony and governance. Across the world in the South Pacific, the city of Nan Madol lies on the eastern shore of the island of Pohnpei in present-day Micronesia. Constructed between the 12th and 17th centuries, it consists of nearly 100 artificial islets built atop coral reefs and connected by a network of canals. Massive basalt columns, some transported from distant parts of the island, were stacked in crisscross patterns to form walls surrounding ceremonial complexes, tombs, and residences of the Saudeleur dynasty. Nan Madol served as both a political and religious center, isolating the elite from the general population on the main island. The engineering required to transport and position the heavy stone columns without metal tools or wheeled vehicles remains a subject of admiration. Oral traditions describe the site as a place of ritual authority and centralized control. By the early 16th century, however, the Saudeleur dynasty had been overthrown, and the new leadership moved away from Nan Madol. Without continuous maintenance, the structures deteriorated under the effects of tides, storms, and vegetation. When European explorers arrived centuries later, they found a silent complex rising from the sea, its canals filled with still water, reflecting broken walls. Moving quietly through Nan Madol at low tide, one encounters narrow passages between stone enclosures, each opening onto courtyards now empty except for wind and the distant sounds of waves. The empty stone doorway, framed by basalt columns darkened by salt and time, marks yet another threshold between a once ordered society and the enduring natural world. As these stories unfold in gentle succession, a broader understanding begins to take shape. Civilizations do not vanish in identical ways, yet certain patterns recur. Environmental pressures, shifting trade networks, political upheaval, and the gradual erosion of institutions that once coordinated collective life. Sometimes the process unfolds over centuries, barely perceptible to those living through it. Other times it accelerates within a few generations, leaving descendants to reinterpret ruins whose original meanings have faded. What remains consistent is the human capacity to build intricate systems, cities aligned with the stars, irrigation networks spanning entire regions, monuments intended to project permanence, and the equally human vulnerability to forces beyond complete control. The empty stone doorway, appearing again and again in different forms across continents, becomes a quiet symbol of this balance. It invites reflection not only on disappearance alone, but on continuity, the understanding that even when structures fall silent, the knowledge, traditions, and genetic legacies of their builders continue in altered forms. As the narrative drifts onward into the stillness of early morning, the sense of time deepens. Each vanished civilization represents not an endpoint, but a transition, a movement within the long arc of human history. The world we inhabit today is layered upon countless earlier worlds, each leaving traces that shape the present in ways often unseen. To listen carefully to these echoes is to recognize that permanence is rare, adaptation constant, and memory itself a fragile thread connecting us to those who walked through these doorways long before the quiet returned.
In the broad expanse of northern Europe, where long winters soften the landscape under snow and summer light stretches late into the evening, there are places where entire communities once thrived, and then slipped so quietly into obscurity that only subtle undulations in the earth reveal their presence. Archaeologists sometimes refer to these as ghost landscapes, regions where fields, roads, and settlements have been erased not by catastrophe, but by centuries of gradual change. One such example lies beneath the peat bogs and farmlands of Scandinavia, where Iron Age villages that flourished between roughly 500 BCE and 800 CE now survive only as post holes, fragments of pottery, and the faint outlines of longhouses visible from aerial surveys. These communities organized their lives around seasonal rhythms, planting and harvest, livestock movement, trade gatherings, and ritual observances tied to the turning of the year. Houses were constructed primarily of timber, turf, and thatch, materials that returned easily to the soil once abandoned. Unlike stone-built cities, these settlements left few monumental markers to assert their former existence. The empty stone doorway appears here only in imagination, replaced by the absence of structures that once sheltered generations. In Denmark, the site of Vorbasse provides a rare window into this pattern. Excavations revealed a village continuously inhabited for nearly 1,000 years before being abandoned around the early Middle Ages. Buildings were periodically rebuilt on slightly different alignments, creating overlapping layers of habitation that reflect gradual adaptation rather than abrupt disruption. The reasons for the final departure are not entirely clear. Shifts in trade networks, changes in political organization, or the consolidation of populations into emerging towns may all have played roles. What remains is a palimpsest of human presence, written in soil rather than stone. Moving eastward into the Eurasian steppe, the nomadic empires that once dominated this vast grassland present another form of disappearance. Unlike sedentary civilizations, steppe societies relied on mobility, seasonal migration, and herds of animals rather than permanent cities. The Xingyu Confederation, which challenged the Han Dynasty of China between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, controlled territories stretching across modern Mongolia and beyond. Their political structure allowed for rapid assembly of cavalry forces and flexible alliances among tribal groups. Because their dwellings were portable, felt tents known as yurts, they left behind few permanent structures. Burial mounds, or kurgans, provide some of the only tangible evidence of their existence, containing grave goods such as weapons, ornaments, and textiles preserved by the dry climate. When the Confederation fragmented under internal pressures and external campaigns, its identity dissolved into successor groups that blended with neighboring populations. The empty stone doorway in this context becomes a metaphor rather than a physical object, a threshold crossed by a society that moved onward rather than leaving ruins behind. Historians reconstruct their story through scattered references in Chinese chronicles and archaeological discoveries that reveal patterns of trade and cultural exchange across the steppe. In the arid landscapes of the American Southwest, another culture emerged and faded in relative obscurity long before European contact. The Hohokam people inhabited the region of present-day southern Arizona between approximately 300 and 1450 CE. Their most remarkable achievement was an extensive system of irrigation canals that diverted water from the Salt and Gila rivers to sustain agriculture in an otherwise inhospitable desert environment. Some canals extended for more than 20 kilometers, demonstrating careful planning and communal labor. Houses were constructed primarily of timber, turf, and thatch, materials that returned easily to the soil once abandoned. Unlike stone-built cities, these settlements left few monumental markers to assert their former existence.
The empty stone doorway appears here only in imagination, replaced by the absence of structures that once sheltered generations. In Denmark, the site of Vorbas provides a rare window into this pattern. Excavations revealed a village continuously inhabited for nearly 1,000 years before being abandoned around the early Middle Ages. Buildings were periodically rebuilt on slightly different alignments, creating overlapping layers of habitation that reflect gradual adaptation rather than abrupt disruption. The reasons for the final departure are not entirely clear. Shifts in trade networks, changes in political organization, or the consolidation of populations into emerging towns may all have played roles. What remains is a palimpsest of human presence, written in soil rather than stone. Moving eastward into the Eurasian steppe, the nomadic empires that once dominated this vast grassland present another form of disappearance. Unlike sedentary civilizations, steppe societies relied on mobility, seasonal migration, and herds of animals rather than permanent cities. The Xingyu Confederation, which challenged the Han Dynasty of China between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, controlled territories stretching across modern Mongolia and beyond. Their political structure allowed for rapid assembly of cavalry forces and flexible alliances among tribal groups. Because their dwellings were portable, felt tents known as yurts, they left behind few permanent structures. Burial mounds, or kurgans, provide some of the only tangible evidence of their existence, containing grave goods such as weapons, ornaments, and textiles preserved by the dry climate. When the Confederation fragmented under internal pressures and external campaigns, its identity dissolved into successor groups that blended with neighboring populations. The empty stone doorway in this context becomes a metaphor rather than a physical object, a threshold crossed by a society that moved onward rather than leaving ruins behind. Historians reconstruct their story through scattered references in Chinese chronicles and archaeological discoveries that reveal patterns of trade and cultural exchange across the steppe. In the arid landscapes of the American Southwest, another culture emerged and faded in relative obscurity long before European contact. The Hohokam people inhabited the region of present-day southern Arizona between approximately 300 and 1450 CE. Their most remarkable achievement was an extensive system of irrigation canals that diverted water from the Salt and Gila rivers to sustain agriculture in an otherwise inhospitable desert environment. Some canals extended for more than 20 kilometers, demonstrating careful planning and communal labor. Houses were constructed primarily of timber, turf, and thatch, materials that returned easily to the soil once abandoned. Unlike stone-built cities, these settlements left few monumental markers to assert their former existence. The empty stone doorway appears here only in imagination, replaced by the absence of structures that once sheltered generations. In Denmark, the site of Vorbas provides a rare window into this pattern. Excavations revealed a village continuously inhabited for nearly 1,000 years before being abandoned around the early Middle Ages. Buildings were periodically rebuilt on slightly different alignments, creating overlapping layers of habitation that reflect gradual adaptation rather than abrupt disruption. The reasons for the final departure are not entirely clear. Shifts in trade networks, changes in political organization, or the consolidation of populations into emerging towns may all have played roles. What remains is a palimpsest of human presence, written in soil rather than stone. Moving eastward into the Eurasian steppe, the nomadic empires that once dominated this vast grassland present another form of disappearance. Unlike sedentary civilizations, steppe societies relied on mobility,
seasonal migration and herds of animals rather than permanent cities. The Xingyu Confederation, which challenged the Han Dynasty of China between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, controlled territories stretching across modern Mongolia and beyond. Their political structure allowed for rapid assembly of cavalry forces and flexible alliances among tribal groups. Because their dwellings were portable, felt tents known as yurts, they left behind few permanent structures. Burial mounds, or kurgans, provide some of the only tangible evidence of their existence, containing grave goods such as weapons, ornaments, and textiles preserved by the dry climate.
Around the 7th century CE, the city experienced internal upheaval. Evidence of deliberate burning in elite compounds suggests social unrest or rebellion. Population declined, and the urban core was gradually abandoned, though surrounding areas remained inhabited. By the time the Aztecs encountered the ruins centuries later, they attributed them to a primordial era beyond living memory. Walking along the Avenue of the Dead at dawn, when the air is cool and the pyramids cast long shadows, one passes through a sequence of plazas and stairways that once guided processions and ceremonies. Each platform and doorway frames the sky differently, reinforcing the sense of movement through a city designed to embody sacred geometry. The empty stone doorway, repeated in temple entrances and residential thresholds, becomes a rhythm guiding the observer through space and time. As these narratives continue to unfold, the diversity of vanished civilizations becomes increasingly apparent. Some disappeared because the environments that sustained them changed. Others declined as political systems fractured or trade networks shifted. Still others transformed so gradually that their descendants carried forward elements of culture without preserving the original structures that defined them. What unites these stories is not disappearance alone, but the persistence of traces, subtle, incomplete, yet enough to reconstruct patterns of life. Archaeology often advances through patient accumulation of small details, a fragment of pottery indicating trade connections, pollen grains revealing ancient crops, isotopic analysis of bones suggesting migration patterns. Each discovery adds another piece to a puzzle whose full picture may never be entirely clear. The recurring image of the empty stone doorway continues to anchor this journey, appearing in different guises across continents and eras. It stands as a quiet threshold between presence and memory, between the lived experience of past communities and the reflective distance of the present. To pass through such a doorway in imagination is to acknowledge both the fragility and resilience of human endeavor. As morning light grows brighter and the world outside begins to stir, the contemplation of vanished civilizations offers a gentle perspective on time itself. Societies rise, adapt, disperse, and reform in new configurations. Landscapes bear the imprint of these cycles long after individual lives have faded. The silence of abandoned places is not empty, but layered with stories waiting to be understood, each one a reminder that history is less a sequence of endings than a continuous process of transformation. And so the journey moves onward still, toward further horizons, where traces of lost worlds remain scattered across deserts, forests, mountains, and coastlines, quiet invitations to consider how much of the human past lies just beyond the edge of memory, preserved in fragments that endure long after the footsteps that created them have faded away.
High in the mountains of the Near East, where narrow valleys open suddenly onto fertile basins and ancient trade routes once threaded between empires, there are ruins that seem suspended outside of time. One such place is the city of Ani, located near the modern border between Turkey and Armenia. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Ani served as the capital of the Bagratid Armenian kingdom and became known as the city of 1,001 churches, a poetic description rather than a literal count, yet one that conveys the density of its religious architecture. Ani occupied a strategic position along segments of the Silk Road, allowing merchants to pass through its gates carrying silk, spices, metals, and textiles between Central Asia and the Mediterranean world. Its walls, reinforced with towers and gates, enclosed a thriving urban center of artisans, traders, clergy, and administrators. Churches built from reddish volcanic stone rose above the cityscape, their domes catching the changing light of sunrise and sunset. Within these walls, daily life unfolded with a rhythm familiar to cities across centuries, markets opening at dawn, bells marking hours of prayer, caravans arriving and departing, families gathering in courtyards as evening cooled the air. The empty stone doorway appears here in the portals of churches whose interiors once echoed with hymns and liturgy in the Armenian language, a continuity stretching back to one of the world's earliest Christian traditions. Ani's decline began in the mid-11th century when the Byzantine Empire annexed the kingdom, followed soon after by incursions from Seljuk forces. Earthquakes damaged structures, trade routes shifted, and political instability weakened the city's position. By the 14th century, it was largely abandoned. Wind swept through streets that had once been crowded, and grass grew between the stones of plazas where merchants had negotiated prices from distant lands. Today, the ruins of Ani stand on a plateau overlooking a deep gorge, the silence broken only by the movement of air across open doorways and roofless walls. The sense of isolation is profound, as though the city has been gently set aside from the flow of history. Further south, in the Arabian Peninsula, the ancient incense trade supported prosperous kingdoms whose wealth derived from aromatic resins such as frankincense and myrrh, prized in religious rituals across the ancient world. The city of Ubar, sometimes associated with the archaeological site of Shisir in present-day Oman, appears in historical references as a caravan hub along Karan-sitters connecting South Arabia to the Mediterranean world. Frankincense trees grow only in specific climatic conditions, and control of their harvest and distribution created economic power for the regions that possessed them. Caravans of camels carried the resin across deserts to ports and markets, forming lifelines of commerce through otherwise inhospitable terrain. Archaeological investigations at Shisir revealed the remains of a fortified settlement surrounding a central well, suggesting a station where caravans could replenish water supplies before continuing their journeys. Geological evidence indicates that the collapse of a limestone cavern beneath the site may have caused part of the structure to sink, contributing to its abandonment. Over time, shifting sands concealed the ruins, giving rise to legends of a lost city swallowed by the desert.
Standing near the exposed foundations today, one sees fragments of walls emerging from sand that move slowly with the wind, reshaping the landscape in subtle ways each year. The empty stone doorway appears half-buried, opening onto dunes that extend toward the horizon, a quiet testament to the vulnerability of settlements dependent on fragile environmental conditions. In the vast interior of Australia, Aboriginal cultures maintained complex systems of knowledge, law, and spirituality for tens of thousands of years without constructing permanent cities in the conventional sense. Their vanishing is not a disappearance of people, but the disruption of cultural continuity following European colonization beginning in the late 18th century. Sacred sites, songlines, oral maps connecting landmarks across the land, and seasonal movement patterns formed a civilization deeply attuned to environment rather than architecture. In some regions, missions and settlements established by colonial authorities displaced communities from ancestral lands, interrupting practices that had persisted for millennia. Archaeological sites containing rock art, tools, and ceremonial spaces remain as evidence of these long-standing traditions. The empty stone doorway here becomes symbolic again, representing access to knowledge systems that survive through oral transmission rather than written records or monumental structures. In the forests of eastern North America, the Iroquoian city of Hochelaga stood on an island in the St. Lawrence River when the French explorer Jacques Cartier visited in 1535. He described a fortified settlement surrounded by fields of maize, with longhouses housing extended families. When later French expeditions returned decades afterward, the village was gone. Its inhabitants had relocated, likely due to shifting alliances, warfare, or disease introduced through early contact. The disappearance of Hochelaga illustrates how swiftly communities can reorganize in response to changing circumstances, leaving behind only brief mentions in historical accounts and archaeological traces beneath modern cities. In the island where the village once stood is now the site of Montreal, layered with centuries of development that obscure earlier landscapes. Across the Sahara Desert, the medieval city of Timgad in present-day Algeria represents a different kind of abandonment. Founded by the Roman Emperor Trajan around 100 CE as a colony for military veterans, Timgad followed a precise grid plan typical of Roman urban design. Its streets intersected at right angles, forming orderly blocks containing houses, baths, markets, and temples. An arch dedicated to Trajan marked the entrance to the city, framing the central avenue. For several centuries, Timgad prospered as a regional administrative center, but as Roman authority weakened and desert sands advanced, the city declined. By the 8th century, it had been largely deserted, gradually buried beneath layers of sand that preserved many structures remarkably well. When excavations uncovered the site in the 19th century, they revealed a city frozen in layout, its streets and doorways intact yet silent. Walking through Timgad today, one can follow the original paving stones, stepping through thresholds that once led into homes filled with conversation and routine. The empty stone doorway appears in its most literal form, repeated endlessly along streets designed for movement and connection, now serving as portals into stillness. In East Asia, the ancient Korean kingdom of Goguryeo established mountain fortresses and cities across northern Korea and parts of Manchuria between the 1st century BCE and the 7th century CE. These fortified capitals were strategically positioned to control river valleys and defend against rival states. Stone walls climbed steep slopes, enclosing palaces, temples, and residential areas. After Goguryeo fell to a combined alliance of Tang China and the Korean kingdom of Silla in 668 CE, many of its strongholds were abandoned.
Over centuries, vegetation covered the remains, leaving only segments of walls visible along ridgelines. Archaeological work has revealed tombs decorated with murals depicting daily life, mythology, and cosmological beliefs, offering insights into a culture that once dominated the region. As evening settles over these mountain sites, mist often gathers in valleys below, creating the impression of islands of stone rising above a shifting sea of clouds. Doorways within the fortifications frame views of distant horizons, emphasizing both the strategic vision of their builders and the solitude that followed their departure. Through each of these accounts, the recurring image of the empty stone doorway continues to guide reflection. It is a simple architectural feature, yet it encapsulates the essence of vanished civilizations, the interface between interior and exterior, between human intention and the wider world. When inhabited, a doorway signifies connection, movement between spaces, encounters, routines. When abandoned, it becomes a symbol of absence, holding open a passage that no one now uses. As this long, unhurried journey moves deeper into the quiet of late morning, the cumulative effect of these stories becomes gently profound. The disappearance of civilizations is not merely a catalogue of losses, but a meditation on impermanence. Every society, no matter how organized or confident, exists within a web of relationships that can shift over time. Climate, trade, belief systems, technology, and human decision-making intertwine in ways that are often visible only in retrospect. Yet there is also continuity in the persistence of human curiosity. The study of these vanished worlds represents an effort to listen across time, to reconstruct voices from fragments, to understand how people adapted to challenges that sometimes exceeded their capacity to respond. In doing so, historians and archaeologists create a bridge between past and present, allowing the memory of these civilizations to remain part of the shared human story. The empty stone doorway, appearing again and again in imagination, stands not as a barrier, but as an invitation, a reminder that history is always incomplete, always open to new discoveries, and always shaped by the quiet passage of time that eventually carries every structure, every institution, and every life toward stillness.
Along the western edge of South America, where the Pacific Ocean meets one of the driest deserts on Earth, the remains of ancient coastal civilizations lie scattered between dunes and barren hills. The Atacama Desert, stretching across northern Chile and southern Peru, preserves traces of cultures that adapted to conditions so extreme that rainfall in some areas is almost unknown. Here, communities relied on the ocean's abundance, fish, shellfish, and sea mammals, rather than agriculture, developing maritime traditions that sustained life for thousands of years. Among these cultures, the Chinchorro people, who lived as early as 7000 BCE, are known today primarily for their elaborate mummification practices, which predate those of ancient Egypt by millennia. They carefully prepared the bodies of the deceased using techniques that involved removing organs, reinforcing skeletons with sticks, and covering the skin with clay and pigment. The purpose of these rituals remains debated, but they suggest a worldview in which ancestors maintained a continuing presence among the living. Over time, the Chinchorro culture transformed and merged with later societies, eventually fading into the broader mosaic of Andean civilizations. Because they did not build large cities or monuments, their disappearance was subtle, marked by the absence of settlements rather than the collapse of urban centers.
The empty stone doorway appears here only as a conceptual threshold between ways of life, from small coastal communities to more centralized states that later dominated the region. Farther inland, the city of Caral in present-day Peru represents one of the earliest known urban centers in the Americas, dating to around 2600 BCE. Situated in the Supe Valley, Caral featured large platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, and residential zones arranged according to a deliberate plan. Unlike many later civilizations, there is little evidence of warfare or defensive structures, suggesting a society organized around trade, religion, and agricultural management. Caral's inhabitants cultivated crops such as cotton, which was used to produce fishing nets essential for coastal economies, creating a symbiotic relationship between inland farmers and maritime communities. Musical instruments made from bone and reed, discovered at the site, hint at ceremonial gatherings where sound and ritual reinforced social cohesion. By around 1800 BCE, Caral was largely abandoned. Environmental changes affecting river flow may have reduced agricultural productivity, while earthquakes common to the region could have damaged infrastructure. The city's decline did not erase human presence from the valley, but marked a transition to different settlement patterns. Sand and sediment gradually covered structures, preserving them until modern excavations revealed their scale. Standing on one of Caral's platform mounds today, one looks out across a landscape that appears almost timeless, the desert light flattening distances and softening contours. The empty stone doorway is replaced by stairways ascending to terraces where ceremonial fires once burned, now open to sky and wind. In the forests of the Amazon basin, archaeological discoveries in recent decades have challenged the long-held assumption that the region was sparsely populated before European contact. Earthworks, raised fields, causeways, and geometric enclosures indicate the presence of complex societies that managed the landscape through controlled burning, soil enhancement, and water regulation. The creation of terra preta, or dark earth, a fertile soil enriched with charcoal and organic matter, allowed sustained agriculture in areas otherwise limited by poor natural soil quality. These societies did not construct stone cities, and many of their structures were made from materials that decomposed quickly in the humid climate. When disease introduced by Europeans spread through the region in the 16th century, populations declined dramatically, leading to the abandonment of settlements that were soon reclaimed by forest. For centuries, the extent of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization remained hidden beneath dense vegetation. Aerial surveys using modern technology have begun to reveal patterns of habitation, networks of villages connected by straight roads and surrounded by defensive ditches. The empty stone doorway appears metaphorically again, represented by clearings in the forest that mark the boundaries of places once filled with human activity, now silent except for the sounds of wildlife. In the island of Sri Lanka, the ancient city of Sigiriya offers another example of a thriving center that later fell into obscurity. Built in the 5th century CE by King Kashapa, Sigiriya was established atop a massive rock formation rising nearly 200 meters above the surrounding plain. The summit contained a palace complex, while terraced gardens, reservoirs, and defensive walls extended below. The ascent to the summit passes through gateways shaped like the paws of a colossal lion, giving the site its name, which means Lion Rock. Frescoes painted on sheltered rock faces depict figures often interpreted as celestial maidens, though their exact significance remains debated. The city functioned as a royal capital for a brief period before the court moved elsewhere, after which the site became a Buddhist monastery. Over centuries, the structures deteriorated and the surrounding jungle advanced. When rediscovered by British surveyors in the 19th century, Sigiriya appeared as a solitary monument emerging from forest, its pathways leading upward through a sequence of terraces and doorways that no longer served their original purpose. The empty stone doorway here frames views of distant plains, emphasizing both isolation and grandeur. In Central Asia, the desert cities of the Khwarezm region, located near the Amu Darya River in present-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, flourished at various times between antiquity and the medieval period. Fortified settlements such as Ayaz Kala and Toprak Kala were constructed from mud brick, their walls rising above the surrounding desert like islands of architecture. These cities controlled irrigation systems that allowed agriculture to flourish in an otherwise arid environment. When river courses shifted or political centers moved, these settlements were abandoned, left to erode slowly under wind and sun. From a distance, their outlines resemble natural formations, blending into the landscape. Approaching them reveals gateways and corridors leading into open courtyards where administrative and residential buildings once stood. The empty stone doorway appears in sun-baked brick, its edges softened by centuries of weathering.
As this quiet procession of vanished civilizations continues, the cumulative impression is not one of sudden endings, but of gradual fading, like footprints disappearing in sand. Human societies adapt continually, and when adaptation requires relocation or transformation, the physical spaces that once defined communal life may be left behind. The reasons vary: environmental stress, economic shifts, external pressures, internal change, yet the outcome is often similar. Structures emptied of purpose, landscapes bearing silent testimony to earlier patterns of existence. The recurring threshold remains a gentle anchor throughout this journey. Whether carved from granite, assembled from coral stone, shaped from mud brick, or imagined in the absence of durable materials, the empty stone doorway symbolizes the passage between what was and what is. It invites contemplation rather than sorrow, encouraging a recognition that impermanence is a natural aspect of history rather than an anomaly. As the day progresses and light grows stronger, illuminating details that night concealed, these reflections settle into a calm awareness of continuity. Modern cities, too, are temporary arrangements within the long timeline of human habitation. Roads, buildings, and institutions that seem permanent today will eventually change, replaced by new forms adapted to conditions not yet fully understood. Yet the study of vanished civilizations offers reassurance as well as humility. It reveals that knowledge accumulates across generations, that lessons learned from past successes and failures inform future choices, and that memory, though fragile, persists through careful preservation and storytelling. The empty stone doorway stands open not only toward the past, but toward the future, a reminder that each society participates in an ongoing narrative far larger than itself. And so the journey moves gently onward, unhurried and reflective, carrying with it the quiet understanding that disappearance is never absolute. Traces remain, waiting to be noticed, interpreted, and woven into the ever-unfolding tapestry of human history, where every ending becomes, in time, the threshold of another beginning. In the highlands of Central Asia, where vast plateaus stretch toward horizons broken only by distant mountain ranges, the traces of ancient caravan cities lie along routes that once carried merchants, pilgrims, and envoys between civilizations. The Silk Road was never a single road, but a network of paths linking China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean.
Along these routes, oasis towns rose wherever water allowed travelers to rest, resupply, and exchange goods. Some endured for centuries, others faded when trade patterns shifted or environmental conditions changed. One such place is the city of Merv in present-day Turkmenistan, which at different times served as a capital for empires, including the Parthians and the Seljuks. At its height in the 12th century, Merv may have been one of the largest cities in the world, known for its libraries, mosques, gardens, and markets. Water from the Murghab River was channeled into irrigation systems that sustained agriculture in the surrounding desert. In 1221, the Mongol invasion, led by forces under the command of Tolui, a son of Genghis Khan, devastated the city. Contemporary accounts describe widespread destruction and loss of life, though exact figures remain uncertain. Merv never fully recovered its former prominence. Over time, shifting river courses and declining political importance led to its abandonment. Today, the site encompasses multiple layers of city walls and ruins representing successive periods of occupation, each encircling the next like rings of history. Walking across the open ground of Merv at dawn, one encounters gateways leading into empty enclosures where buildings once stood. The empty stone doorway appears here in mud brick arches, their surfaces eroded by centuries of wind, opening onto expanses of silence that once echoed with the movement of caravans and scholars. In the east, in western China's Gansu province, the city of Karakoto, known as the Black City, was founded during the Western Xia dynasty around the 11th century. Positioned near the edge of the Gobi Desert, it functioned as a frontier stronghold and trade center. After the Mongol conquest in the 13th century, the city continued to be inhabited under new administration until it was abandoned in the late 14th century, possibly due to environmental changes affecting water supply. When explorers rediscovered Karakoto in the early 20th century, they found structures partially buried in sand, along with manuscripts in the Tangut script that had been lost to history. These texts provided valuable insights into a culture that had nearly vanished without leaving a living linguistic tradition. The empty stone doorway here leads into rooms filled with not furnishings, but with the lingering presence of knowledge once carefully recorded and then forgotten. In the Mediterranean, the island of Sardinia contains the remnants of the Nuragic civilization, which developed between approximately 1800 and 700 BCE. Its most distinctive structures are the nuraghe, massive stone towers built from stacked basalt blocks without mortar. Thousands of these towers once dotted the landscape, often accompanied by villages, temples, and burial sites. Their precise function remains debated. They may have served as defensive fortifications, communal centers, or symbols of authority. By the first millennium BCE, external influences from Phoenician and later Roman colonization transformed the island's cultural landscape. The nuragic system gradually dissolved, leaving the towers as enduring markers of a society whose internal organization is still not fully understood. Many stand isolated on hills, their entrances framing views of valleys and coastlines shaped by millennia of human activity. Approaching a nuraghe at sunset, one steps through a low doorway into a circular chamber where light filters down from an opening above. The emptiness is not desolate, but contemplative, as though the structure itself invites quiet reflection on the people who once gathered within its walls. In Southeast Asia, the ancient kingdom of Champa occupied parts of present-day central and southern Vietnam from roughly the 2nd century CE until the 15th century. Champa's cities were centers of maritime trade, linking China, India, and the Indonesian archipelago. Brick temples dedicated to Hindu deities, particularly Shiva, rose above river valleys and coastal plains, decorated with intricate carvings depicting mythological scenes.
Repeated conflicts with neighboring states, especially Divet to the north and the Khmer Empire to the west, weakened Champa over time. By the late 15th century, much of its territory had been absorbed, and its political independence effectively ended. The Cham people continue to live in Vietnam and Cambodia today, preserving elements of their language and traditions, but the urban centers that once defined the kingdom have largely disappeared. Temple complexes, such as My Son, remain as quiet remnants, their towers partially collapsed, yet still bearing traces of artistry. Doorways framed by carved lintels open into sanctuaries where statues once stood, now empty except for filtered light and the sound of insects in the surrounding forest. Across the ocean in the North Atlantic, the Norse settlement of Greenland offers a different perspective on disappearance. Established around 985 CE by settlers led by Eric the Red, the colonies on Greenland's southwestern coast supported farms, churches, and trading posts connected to Scandinavia and Iceland. For several centuries, these communities adapted to a marginal environment through pastoral farming and hunting. By the 15th century, however, the settlements had vanished. The reasons remain debated and likely include climate cooling associated with the period sometimes called the Little Ice Age, isolation from European trade networks, soil erosion from overgrazing, and possible conflict or limited interaction with Inuit populations who were better adapted to Arctic conditions. When later European explorers arrived, they found abandoned farms and churches, their stone walls standing amid grass and tundra. The empty stone doorway appears in the ruins of Havelsey Church, one of the best preserved structures, where the roof is gone, but the walls remain intact. It is easy to imagine the final gatherings held there before the community dispersed, leaving behind a quiet testament to the challenges of sustaining life at the edge of habitability. In the heart of the Sahara, the medieval trading city of Tod Mecca once thrived as a center for trans-Saharan commerce in gold, salt, and textiles. Situated in present-day Mali, it connected West African kingdoms with North African and Middle Eastern markets. Arabic sources from the 10th and 11th centuries describe a prosperous settlement with stone houses and mosques. As trade routes shifted and new centers rose to prominence, Tod Mecca declined. Today, only low walls and foundations remain, blending into the rocky terrain. The silence of the site is profound, broken only by wind moving across open ground, where caravans once assembled before long desert journeys. Through all these accounts, the recurring threshold continues to guide the narrative. The empty stone doorway, whether standing in a ruined church in Greenland, a desert fortress in Central Asia, or a temple in Southeast Asia, serves as a quiet symbol of passage. It marks the boundary between the lived past and the contemplative present, inviting reflection on how societies adapt, endure, and sometimes fade beyond recognition. As the afternoon light softens and shadows lengthen, the accumulation of these stories forms a gentle meditation on time's depth. No civilization vanishes entirely. Elements persist in language, technology, belief, and cultural memory. Yet the specific arrangements that once defined collective identity can dissolve, leaving behind fragments that require patience and imagination to interpret. The study of these vanished worlds is not an exercise in nostalgia, but an exploration of resilience and change. It reminds us that stability is often temporary, that innovation arises from necessity, and that human communities have always navigated uncertainty with creativity and determination.
The empty stone doorway remains open, not as a relic of loss, but as a passage through which understanding can continue to flow, linking past and present in an unbroken, if sometimes faint, continuum. And so the journey proceeds, calm and unhurried, carrying forward into the quiet evening the awareness that history is composed as much of absences as of achievements, each vanished civilization contributing its silent chapter to the long and unfolding story of humanity. As the evening settles gently across the world, there are landscapes where the fading light reveals outlines of structures that seem to belong more to memory than to the present. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, where some of humanity's earliest cities first took shape, entire urban traditions rose and fell long before later empires recorded their histories. Among these was the Sumerian civilization of southern Mesopotamia, which flourished between roughly 3500 and 2000 BCE in the river plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Cities such as Ur, Uruk, and Eridu developed systems of writing, administration, and monumental architecture that would influence cultures for millennia. Ziggurats, stepped temple towers built from mud brick, dominated the skylines, symbolizing connections between the earthly realm and the divine. Canals diverted river water into fields of barley and date palms, sustaining dense populations in an otherwise arid environment. Yet even these foundational cities experienced cycles of abandonment. Changes in river courses, salinization of soil from prolonged irrigation, and political upheaval gradually weakened the region's capacity to support large urban centers. Ur, once a thriving port connected to the Persian Gulf, found itself increasingly distant from the sea as sediment altered the coastline. By the early first millennium BCE, the city was largely deserted, its great ziggurat standing amid open plain. Approaching the ruins at twilight, one sees the massive platform rising above ground level, its stairways leading to a summit that no longer holds a temple. Doorways within the structure open into empty chambers where priests once conducted rituals marking the passage of seasons and the favor of gods. The empty stone doorway appears here as an entrance to sacred space, now silent but still imposing.
Further north, the city of Hatra in present-day Iraq flourished during the 1st centuries CE as a fortified center of trade and religion under the Parthian Empire. Massive circular walls enclosed temples dedicated to a pantheon blending Mesopotamian, Greek, and Arabian deities, reflecting the city's position at a cultural crossroads. Its resilience allowed it to withstand sieges by Roman forces, demonstrating both strategic strength and political autonomy. Hatra declined after the rise of the Sasanian Empire in the 3rd century CE, eventually falling and being abandoned. Desert winds carried sand into streets and courtyards, preserving columns and arches beneath shifting layers. Walking through the site today, one encounters grand entrances framed by carved stone, leading into sanctuaries open to the sky. The repetition of thresholds emphasizes the city's former vitality as a place of pilgrimage and commerce. In the Nile Valley of Sudan, the Kingdom of Kush established its own centers of power south of Egypt, with capitals at Napata and later Meroe, between roughly 800 BCE and 350 CE. The Kushites built pyramids, temples, and cities that reflected both Egyptian influence and distinct local traditions.
Meroe became a hub of iron production, trade, and administration, supporting a complex society that interacted with Mediterranean and African networks. By the 4th century CE, however, Meroe was abandoned. Scholars suggest a combination of environmental degradation from deforestation associated with iron smelting, shifts in trade routes, and military pressures from neighboring states. The pyramids of Meroe now stand in relative isolation, their steep sides rising from desert sands without the surrounding urban context that once gave them meaning. At sunrise, shadows stretch across the dunes, emphasizing the geometry of these monuments. Doorways at the base of the pyramids lead into burial chambers that were looted in antiquity, leaving only the architectural shell. The empty stone doorway here becomes a literal entrance into absence, a passage once intended to connect the living and the dead, now marking the distance between past belief and present understanding. Across the sea in southern Europe, the Etruscan civilization of central Italy flourished before the rise of Rome, developing sophisticated urban centers, art, and religious practices between the 8th and 3rd centuries BCE. Cities such as Tarquinia, Veii, and Cerveteri featured planned streets, defensive walls, and elaborate tomb complexes carved into rock. The Etruscans influenced early Roman culture in areas ranging from engineering to ritual symbolism. As Rome expanded, Etruscan cities were gradually absorbed into the Roman Republic. Their language fell out of use, surviving only in inscriptions that scholars have partially deciphered. While the people themselves did not disappear, the distinct identity of their civilization faded into the broader Roman world. Tombs painted with scenes of banquets, music, and athletic contests provide glimpses of a society confident in its customs, even as its political independence waned. Descending into one of these tombs, visitors pass through a narrow doorway into chambers where colors remain surprisingly vivid after more than 2,000 years. The quiet inside is profound, as though time itself has paused. The empty stone doorway marks the transition from daylight into a preserved fragment of ancient life. In the far north of Scotland, the abandoned medieval village of Skara Brae has already offered a glimpse into prehistoric life, but other settlements across the British Isles also disappeared as populations shifted. The village of Warham Percy in England, inhabited from the medieval period until the 16th century, was eventually deserted due to economic changes, including the conversion of farmland to sheep pastures during the rise of the wool trade. Houses were dismantled, leaving only earthworks and the remains of a church. Standing among the low ridges that outlined former streets, one senses how easily a community can dissolve when livelihoods change. The church doorway, still intact though roofless, frames the sky, symbolizing both continuity of faith and the fragility of settlement patterns tied to economic forces. In the Pacific in Japan, the city of Heijo-kyo, now part of modern Nara, served as the imperial capital during the 8th century before the court relocated. Built on a grid pattern modeled after Chinese cities, it contained palaces, temples, and administrative districts. When the capital moved, many structures were dismantled or fell into disuse, their materials reused elsewhere. Archaeological reconstruction has revealed foundations indicating the scale of what once existed. Here, disappearance took the form of deliberate relocation rather than collapse. the empty stone doorway becomes conceptual again, representing a threshold between successive centers of power within the same cultural continuum. As darkness gradually deepens and the stars begin to appear, the accumulated weight of these stories settles into a quiet understanding. Civilizations that vanished without a trace rarely did so entirely. Instead, they transformed, dispersed, or were absorbed into new configurations. What vanished was the specific arrangement of institutions, beliefs, and environments that once sustained them. The recurring image of the empty stone doorway has guided this journey from the beginning, appearing in temples, homes, fortresses, tombs, and imagined spaces where no physical structure survives. It symbolizes the passage of time more eloquently than any monument, a simple opening that once framed daily life and now frames memory. Through it, we glimpse not only the absence of those who built these civilizations, but also the continuity of human experience across generations. In the quiet that follows this long exploration, there is a sense not of finality, but of perspective. The present moment, too, will one day become part of the past, its structures altered or replaced, its routines remembered only through traces. Yet the study of vanished civilizations affirms that knowledge endures, carried forward by curiosity and care. If this journey through history has lingered in your thoughts, it may be because it touches something universal, the awareness that every society participates in a cycle of creation and transformation, leaving behind thresholds for future generations to cross in their search for understanding. The empty stone doorway remains open, illuminated softly by starlight, inviting anyone who passes to pause, reflect, and listen for the faint echoes of lives once lived beyond its frame.
Night settles fully now, and with it comes a deeper stillness, the kind that invites reflection on spans of time far longer than a single lifetime, longer even than the memory of any one culture. In this quiet, it becomes possible to consider civilizations whose traces are so faint that only careful, patient study reveals that they existed at all. Some left no towering monuments, no written records, no visible ruins rising above the earth. Their presence survives in patterns beneath the soil, in genetic lineages, in tools worn smooth by hands that have long since returned to dust. In the river valleys of northern China, long before the rise of the Shang and Zhou dynasties, Neolithic cultures such as the Langzhou civilization flourished between roughly 3300 and 2300 BCE. Centered in the Yangtze River Delta, Langzhou society constructed large earthen platforms, sophisticated water management systems, and finely crafted jade objects that required immense labor and skill. Jade Kong, cylindrical artifacts with square outer shapes, were placed in elite burials, suggesting ritual significance tied to cosmological beliefs. Excavations have revealed evidence of social hierarchy, specialized labor, and urban planning, indicating a complex society long before China's traditionally recorded dynastic history. Yet around 2300 BCE, Langzhou settlements were abandoned. Geological studies suggest that catastrophic flooding may have inundated the region, overwhelming infrastructure and forcing populations to relocate. Over millennia, sediment buried the remains so completely that the civilization was unknown until modern archaeology uncovered it. Here, the empty stone doorway exists only metaphorically, represented by the raised platforms that once supported buildings now vanished.
They stand as silent foundations, marking where structures once defined space and community. To the west, in the Iranian plateau, the Bronze Age city of Jiroft has emerged as another example of a sophisticated culture that faded into obscurity. Discovered through archaeological investigations in the early 21st century, the site revealed monumental architecture, intricate chlorite stone carvings, and evidence of long-distance trade. Some scholars have proposed that Jiroft may correspond to a legendary land mentioned in ancient Mesopotamian texts, though this identification remains debated. By the second millennium BCE, the region's urban centers declined, possibly due to environmental changes affecting river systems or shifts in trade routes. Without continuous habitation, structures eroded and artifacts were scattered by natural processes and human activity. The story of Jiroft is still being reconstructed, illustrating how much of the ancient world remains hidden, awaiting discovery. In the dense forests of Central Africa, archaeological work has revealed the remains of early ironworking societies that flourished before written history in the region. Furnaces, slag heaps, and settlement patterns indicate organized communities engaged in metallurgy, agriculture, and trade. Over time, migrations, climate fluctuations, and cultural transformations altered these societies, leaving behind traces that are difficult to interpret without oral traditions to provide context. In the circular outlines of huts once made from wood and clay, now visible only as discolorations in the soil, these subtle marks require trained eyes to recognize, yet they represent lives as complex and meaningful as those of any monumental civilization. In the islands of the Caribbean, the Taino people developed chiefdoms supported by agriculture, fishing, and inter-island exchange prior to European contact in the late 15th century. They built ceremonial plazas, ball courts, and villages arranged around central spaces. Wooden structures and thatched roofs left little lasting architectural evidence, and the catastrophic impact of disease, forced labor, and colonization led to a rapid decline in population and social organization. Though Taino descendants survive today, much of their pre-contact civilization was disrupted within a few generations, leaving archaeologists to piece together its character from artifacts, early accounts, and surviving cultural practices. The empty stone doorway appears in the stone-lined ball courts where communal games once took place, now quiet beneath tropical vegetation. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, coastal societies constructed large wooden plank houses and totem poles that expressed lineage, status, and spiritual beliefs. Because these materials decay in damp climates, entire villages have vanished, their locations indicated only by shell middens, mounds of discarded shells, and depressions marking house sites. Oral histories preserved by descendant communities provide crucial insight into these places, demonstrating that disappearance in the archaeological sense does not equate to cultural extinction. As the night deepens further, the narrative reaches a contemplative calm. The examples have spanned continents and millennia, yet the underlying themes remain consistent: adaptation, transformation, and the quiet fading of particular forms of life. Civilizations that vanished without a trace did not simply end, they became part of the foundation upon which later societies built. The recurring image of the empty stone doorway now feels less like a symbol of absence and more like one of continuity. A doorway implies both departure and arrival. It suggests that while one group may pass through and leave, another may follow, reshaping the space according to new needs and beliefs. History, in this sense, is an endless sequence of thresholds, each generation stepping into a world shaped by those who came before. In this stillness, it is possible to imagine standing before such a doorway at the edge of an abandoned city, just before sleep overtakes the landscape. The air is cool, carrying faint scents of earth and stone. Stars arc slowly overhead, unchanged by the rise and fall of human societies. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other cities glow with life, repeating patterns that have unfolded countless times across history. The reflection that remains is gentle rather than solemn. The disappearance of civilizations is not merely a record of loss, but a reminder of resilience, of the capacity of human communities to move, adapt, and begin again in new places. History, in this sense, is an endless sequence of thresholds, each generation stepping into a world shaped by those who came before. In this stillness, it is possible to imagine standing before such a doorway at the edge of an abandoned city, just before sleep overtakes the landscape. The air is cool, carrying faint scents of earth and stone. Stars arc slowly overhead, unchanged by the rise and fall of human societies. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other cities glow with life, repeating patterns that have unfolded countless times across history. The reflection that remains is gentle rather than solemn. The disappearance of civilizations is not merely a record of loss, but a reminder of resilience, of the capacity of human communities to move, adapt, and begin again in new places. History, in this sense, is an endless sequence of thresholds, each generation stepping into a world shaped by those who came before. In this stillness, it is possible to imagine standing before such a doorway at the edge of an abandoned city, just before sleep overtakes the landscape. The air is cool, carrying faint scents of earth and stone. Stars arc slowly overhead, unchanged by the rise and fall of human societies. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other cities glow with life, repeating patterns that have unfolded countless times across history. The reflection that remains is gentle rather than solemn. The disappearance of civilizations is not merely a record of loss, but a reminder of resilience, of the capacity of human communities to move, adapt, and begin again in new places. History, in this sense, is an endless sequence of thresholds, each generation stepping into a world shaped by those who came before. In this stillness, it is possible to imagine standing before such a doorway at the edge of an abandoned city, just before sleep overtakes the landscape. The air is cool, carrying faint scents of earth and stone. Stars arc slowly overhead, unchanged by the rise and fall of human societies. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other cities glow with light.
In the final quiet hours before midnight gives way to the earliest hint of another dawn, there is a particular kind of stillness that seems to gather all the layers of the past into a single, gentle awareness. It is the hour when cities grow hushed, when distant sounds soften, and when imagination can move most easily across centuries. In this calm, the story of civilizations that vanished without a trace resolves not into a catalogue of mysteries, but into a long, unbroken reflection on the nature of human time. Across every continent, communities have built places they believed would endure, towns laid out with care, temples aligned with the movements of the heavens, roads connecting neighborhoods and fields, thresholds marking the boundary between private life and the wider world. For a time, each of these places felt permanent to the people who lived there. Children grew into adults, elders passed on knowledge, and daily routines repeated until they seemed as reliable as the sunrise. Yet slowly, often almost imperceptibly, circumstances shifted. Rivers altered their courses, forests receded or advanced, Trade winds carried ships to different harbors. New beliefs emerged, new alliances formed, new pressures arose. What vanished again and again was not humanity itself, but the specific pattern that held a particular society together at a particular moment. The Indus cities, the palaces of Crete, the temples of Angkor, the mound complexes of Cahokia, the stone enclosures of Great Zimbabwe, the coral-built towns of the Swahili coast, the desert fortresses of Central Asia, the mountain capitals of Armenia, the irrigation networks of the Hohokam, the ceremonial centers of the Maya, each represented a unique arrangement of environment, technology, governance, and belief. When one element changed beyond the capacity of the system to adjust, the pattern loosened. People moved, adapted, merged with neighbors, or restructured their communities in quieter forms that left fewer visible traces. The recurring image of the empty stone doorway has accompanied this entire journey as a gentle anchor. It is a simple object, yet it holds profound meaning. A doorway exists only because there was once a wall, and a wall exists because there was once a need to define space, to create shelter, security, or sacred separation. When the wall falls away and the doorway remains, it becomes a frame through which the past can be glimpsed without being fully recovered. It marks the point where presence ended and memory began. Imagine standing before such a doorway at the edge of a long abandoned settlement. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of dust and vegetation. Moonlight outlines the shape of the opening, revealing textures worn smooth by countless hands. Beyond it lies a courtyard where no voices rise, a path where no footsteps sound. Yet the silence is not empty. It contains the accumulated weight of ordinary lives, conversations at dusk, meals shared, worries about weather and harvest, celebrations of births and marriages, quiet moments of reflection beneath the same sky that stretches overhead tonight. Historians often speak of collapse, decline, or disappearance, but these words can obscure the continuity that underlies change. When a city is abandoned, its people do not dissolve into nothing. They carry skills, memories, and traditions into new places. Languages evolve, stories adapt, tools are redesigned, crops are replanted in different soils. Even when written records vanish, cultural patterns persist in ways that may not be immediately visible, but remain embedded in later societies. The study of vanished civilizations, therefore, is not only about uncovering what was lost, but also about recognizing what endured. Agricultural techniques developed in ancient river valleys continue to influence modern farming. Architectural principles refined in early cities shape contemporary design. Systems of law, measurement, and governance trace their origins to experiments conducted thousands of years ago. The past is present in ways so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. As this long narrative draws toward rest, another realization emerges, that the sense of mystery surrounding vanished civilizations reflects a fundamental aspect of human awareness. We know that our own time, too, will eventually recede into history. Buildings that feel permanent today will weather and erode. Technologies that seem indispensable will become obsolete. Future generations will interpret our world through the fragments we leave behind, just as we interpret the worlds that came before. Yet there is no urgency in this understanding, only a quiet acceptance. Change is not an interruption of history, but its natural rhythm. The rise and transformation of societies resemble the slow movement of tides along a shoreline, advancing, retreating, reshaping the land in ways that are both subtle and profound.
Each wave leaves traces, smoothing stones, depositing sand, revealing layers beneath the surface. If you were to walk through one of those ancient doorways now in the imagination that accompanies the edge of sleep, you might notice how the darkness inside is not complete. There is always a faint light from the sky beyond, enough to outline shapes and suggest possibilities. In that dimness, the past feels less distant, less separate from the present. The people who built these places were not so different from those who inhabit the world today. They sought stability, meaning, connection, and understanding, the same quiet aspirations that continue to guide human life. And so the journey ends not with a final conclusion, but with a gentle return to stillness. Civilizations that vanished without a trace have not truly disappeared. They have become part of the deep foundation upon which the present stands. Their stories persist in landscapes, in inherited knowledge, in the enduring curiosity that drives exploration and study. The empty stone doorway remains, illuminated now by the first pale hint of another approaching dawn. It stands open, as it always has, between what was and what will be, a silent reminder that history is not a closed book, but an ever-unfolding passage, inviting each generation to step through, look back with care, and move forward with quiet awareness into the vast, continuous flow of time. The first light of morning returns almost imperceptibly, a gradual softening of darkness rather than a sudden change, and with it comes a sense that the long passage through vanished worlds has circled back to the present. In this gentle light, ruins across the globe, from deserts to jungles to windswept coasts, begin to take shape again, their outlines emerging from shadow as they have done for centuries. Each day repeats this quiet unveiling, as if the earth itself remembers where cities once stood and reveals them patiently to anyone willing to look. What becomes clear after moving slowly through so many stories is that disappearance rarely means total erasure. Even in places where no walls remain, the land holds subtle memories. Soil retains the imprint of ancient fields. Rivers follow courses altered by long-forgotten canals. Plant species spread by human cultivation continue to grow in regions where their original caretakers are gone. Languages preserve words whose origins trace back to cultures that no longer exist as distinct identities. In this way, the world itself becomes an archive, storing evidence not in books, but in landscapes.
The empty stone doorway, which has guided this journey from beginning to end, now seems less like a relic and more like a universal form repeated across time. Every home, every temple, every public building required an entrance, a point of transition between inside and outside, between safety and uncertainty, between the known and the unknown. To pass through a doorway is to participate in a ritual of movement that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. When the structure around it disappears, the doorway stands as a distilled symbol of that shared human experience. Consider how many countless passages occurred through the thresholds of the civilizations we have visited. Merchants carrying goods from distant lands, farmers returning from fields at dusk, children stepping outside to watch seasonal festivals, messengers arriving with news that would alter the course of communities, pilgrims entering sacred spaces in search of reassurance or meaning. Each crossing represented a moment in a life that felt immediate and significant to the person living it, yet from the perspective of centuries, it becomes part of a pattern too vast to trace individually. There is also a quiet comfort in recognizing that the forces shaping the fate of civilizations are not solely destructive. Environmental change, for example, can challenge societies, but it also encourages innovation and adaptation. Trade networks may collapse in one region while opening new opportunities in another. Political systems may fragment, allowing smaller communities to develop distinct identities and practices. Transformation, though often difficult, can lead to renewal in forms that are not immediately visible. Historians sometimes describe this process as resilience, the capacity of human societies to absorb disruption and reorganize. Even when cities are abandoned, knowledge migrates with people, carried in memory and tradition. Techniques for building, farming, navigation, and governance are rarely lost entirely. They are modified, transmitted, and rediscovered. The vanished civilization becomes a quiet ancestor to those that follow, shaping possibilities in ways that are seldom acknowledged but always present. As the sun rises higher, illuminating the remains of ancient places scattered across continents, the sense of continuity grows stronger. Tourists walk along paths where traders once hurried. Researchers brush dust from artifacts touched by hands long gone. Local communities maintain connections to ancestral lands, preserving stories that bridge past and present. The silence of ruins is not a void, but a pause, a space where reflection becomes possible. If one were to sit beside an empty stone doorway in such a place and simply watch the changing light, hours might pass unnoticed. Shadows would shift, birds would cross the sky, wind would move through grasses or broken corridors. The doorway would remain unchanged, indifferent to the passage of time, yet defined by it. In that stillness, it would be possible to sense how countless generations have experienced the same rhythm of day and night, season and season, life and departure. This awareness gently reframes the idea of civilizations vanishing without a trace. The trace is always there, though sometimes it requires patience to perceive. It exists in the continuity of human presence on Earth, in the fact that every community, past and present, contributes to an ongoing story that has no clear beginning and no final ending. What disappears is the arrangement, not the impulse behind it. And so, as this long narrative settles into its final calm, the journey returns to where it began, with the image of a place once filled with voices, now quiet but not forgotten. Over the course of these hours, we have moved from river valleys to island shores, from mountain fortresses to desert cities, from monumental capitals to subtle traces beneath forests and fields. Each example has offered a different perspective on how societies flourish and change, how memory persists, and how the physical world records human presence even after names and languages fade. If this journey through history has stayed with you as the day begins, it may be because it speaks to a universal awareness that we too are passing through our own doorways, shaping a present that will one day become part of the distant past. There is no need for urgency in that thought, only a quiet appreciation for the continuity it represents. The empty stone doorway stands in the morning light, open as always, inviting reflection rather than conclusion. Beyond it lies not an ending, but an ongoing landscape of human experience, stretching forward just as it stretches back. And in that balanced stillness, where past and future meet in the calm of the present moment, the story of civilizations that vanished without a trace becomes gently and reassuringly the story of humanity itself, enduring, adapting, and moving onward through time, without hurry, without noise, and without ever truly disappearing. The recurring image of the empty stone doorway now seems to expand beyond architecture into a broader metaphor for historical understanding. Each discovery, a buried wall, a fragment of inscription, a change in soil composition, is like stepping through a doorway into another layer of time. The process is gradual and careful, requiring patience rather than urgency. Knowledge accumulates slowly, piece by piece, until a clearer picture emerges of how people once lived, organized themselves, and responded to challenges. What becomes especially evident is that no civilization exists in isolation. Trade, migration, conflict, and cooperation connect societies across vast distances. When one civilization declines, its neighbors often absorb its people and ideas, creating new cultural forms. The disappearance of a city may coincide with the rise of another elsewhere, linked by networks that shift like currents in an ocean. Consider how the fall of certain Bronze Age powers in the Eastern Mediterranean created opportunities for new groups to establish themselves, eventually giving rise to classical Greek civilization. Or how the transformation of trade routes in Central Asia led to the emergence of new centers along the Silk Road. These transitions were not abrupt endings, but reconfigurations, each doorway leading into another space shaped by inherited knowledge and fresh circumstances. As midday approaches and shadows shorten, the emotional tone of this reflection settles into quiet reassurance. The vanished civilizations explored throughout this journey no longer seem fragile or tragic. Instead, they appear as essential chapters in a continuous narrative. Their achievements, struggles, and adaptations contributed to the world that exists today, even if their names are not widely remembered. If one were to return now to the imagined doorway that has anchored this entire passage through time, it would no longer feel lonely or abandoned. Instead, it would appear as part of a vast network of thresholds connecting past, present, and future. Every generation stands within its own doorway, looking back at what came before, while facing forward toward possibilities not yet realized. Perhaps the most calming realization is that the disappearance of civilizations has never halted the broader story of humanity. New communities form, new ideas emerge, and new forms of cooperation develop. The capacity for renewal is as fundamental as the tendency toward decline. In this sense, the empty doorway is not a symbol of loss, but of continuity, an opening through which life continues to move. As the sun reaches its highest point and the world hums with activity, the quiet perspective gained from contemplating vanished civilizations remains like a soft echo. It encourages patience, humility, and a deeper awareness of how interconnected all periods of history truly are. Nothing stands entirely alone. Every moment is linked to countless others stretching backward and forward through time. And so the journey, though it has traveled across thousands of years and countless places, resolves into a simple, steady understanding. Civilizations may vanish from the surface of the world, but the human story does not. It flows onward, shaped by memory, environment, and imagination, carrying forward the legacy of those who came before. The empty stone doorway remains where it has always been, not at the end of the path, but along it, quietly marking the passage of generations. Anyone who pauses there can sense the continuity that underlies change, the enduring presence within apparent absence, and the calm assurance that history, like the turning of the earth beneath the midday sun, continues without interruption, inviting each new traveler to step through and add their own brief chapter to the endless, unfolding narrative of human civilization. As afternoon begins its slow descent toward evening once more, the light softens and long shadows return to the landscapes that have carried so many traces of vanished worlds.
It is in this quieter part of the day that reflection often deepens, when activity eases and attention drifts toward broader horizons. The story of civilizations that vanished without a trace, when considered over such a long arc, begins to resemble the steady breathing of the planet itself: expansion and contraction, emergence and withdrawal, presence and quiet. There are places on Earth where entire coastlines have shifted since ancient communities first settled there. Along the North Sea, for instance, archaeologists have identified the remains of prehistoric forests now submerged beneath shallow waters. These landscapes, sometimes called drowned worlds, were once home to hunter-gatherer groups who followed seasonal migrations of animals and fish. Rising sea levels after the last ice age gradually inundated these regions, forcing populations to relocate inland. What vanished was not a city or kingdom, but an entire habitable landscape, transformed into seabed. Divers occasionally report encountering preserved tree stumps or stone tools beneath the water, silent evidence of lives lived where waves now move endlessly. The empty stone doorway here becomes an imagined threshold at the edge of the shore, a point where land once extended farther than the eye can see today. It reminds us that geography itself is not fixed, but constantly reshaped by natural processes beyond human control. In Southeast Asia, the ancient port city of Ak-Eo in the Mekong Delta flourished between the 1st and 7th centuries CE as part of the Funan civilization. Archaeological discoveries include canals, jewelry, coins from distant regions, and evidence of long-distance trade connecting India, China, and the Roman world. Over time, sediment from the Mekong River altered the coastline, and political changes shifted trade to other ports. The city was gradually abandoned, its structures buried beneath layers of alluvial soil. Excavations in the 20th century revealed foundations and artifacts that had remained hidden for more than 1,000 years. The site demonstrates how environmental change and economic transformation can combine to redirect the flow of history, leaving former centers of activity to fade quietly into obscurity. In the high plains of central North America, the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples established fortified villages along the Missouri River, constructing earthen lodge dwellings arranged around central plazas. These communities served as hubs of trade, linking nomadic groups of the plains with agricultural societies to the east and west. Epidemics, introduced through indirect contact with Europeans in the 18th century, devastated populations, leading to abandonment of some settlements. Descendant communities survived and reorganized, preserving cultural traditions, even as village sites fell silent.
Archaeological remains include circular depressions marking the locations of earth lodges and remnants of palisade walls. From a distance, these features resemble natural undulations in the grassland, visible only when light strikes at certain angles. The empty stone doorway appears again as a conceptual passage, the entrance to a lodge that once opened onto a vibrant communal space, now returned to open prairie. In the Andes, the Inca city of Machu Picchu endured a different kind of disappearance. Constructed in the 15th century on a ridge between mountain peaks, it served as a royal estate or ceremonial center connected to the wider Inca road network. When Spanish forces entered the region in the 16th century, they never found the site, and it was gradually abandoned, possibly due to political upheaval and the disruption of imperial administration. Over centuries, vegetation enveloped the terraces and buildings, concealing them from the outside world. When the site was brought to wider international attention in the early 20th century, it appeared as a city suspended between sky and forest, remarkably preserved by isolation.
Terraces still traced the contours of the mountains, and stone structures stood intact without mortar, fitted so precisely that even earthquakes had not displaced them significantly. Doorways framed views of distant peaks, emphasizing the integration of architecture with landscape. Standing at one of these thresholds at sunrise, one sees clouds drifting through valleys below, as though the city floats above the world. The empty stone doorway here becomes a frame for the vastness of nature, suggesting that even the most carefully planned human spaces remain part of a larger environment that ultimately determines their fate. As the afternoon light warms and lengthens, the cumulative effect of these reflections settles into a gentle clarity. Civilizations that vanished without a trace did not simply fail. They participated in processes of change that continued to shape the world today. Coastlines shift, rivers migrate, climates fluctuate, technologies evolve, and societies respond in ways that sometimes succeed and sometimes do not. The disappearance of one form of organization often creates space for another to emerge. What remains constant is the human inclination to build, to connect, to seek stability amid uncertainty. Every settlement, whether a small village or a vast capital, represents an attempt to create order and meaning in a dynamic world. When that order dissolves, the impulse behind it does not vanish. It reappears in new forms, adapted to new circumstances. The empty stone doorway, recurring across this long narrative, now feels like a universal symbol of that continuity. It stands at the intersection of time, marking the point where one chapter closes and another begins. To step through it is to acknowledge both loss and possibility, both memory and renewal. As evening approaches once more and the sky begins its gradual transition towards softer colors, the journey through vanished civilizations reaches a state of quiet completeness. There is no final mystery to solve, no single explanation that accounts for every disappearance. Instead, there is an understanding that impermanence is woven into the fabric of history, just as growth and change are woven into the fabric of life. If you were to walk now through a landscape where an ancient city once stood, you might notice how seamlessly the present has settled over the past. Grass grows where streets once ran. Birds nest in the crevices of walls. Paths formed by modern footsteps cross those shaped by ancient ones. The world continues, carrying forward traces of what came before without needing to preserve every detail. And in that calm awareness, the story finds its natural resting place. Civilizations that vanished without a trace have not been erased. They have become part of the deep, quiet foundation of the human experience. The empty stone doorway remains, illuminated by the fading light of day, open to anyone who pauses to consider the passage of time. A silent reminder that while societies may rise and fade, the enduring thread of humanity moves onward, steady and unbroken, through every threshold it encounters. As twilight returns once again, completing the long arc from night to day and back toward night, there is a sense that the journey through vanished civilizations has come full circle. The sky dims slowly, colors fading from gold to blue to the deepening gray that precedes the first stars. In this calm transition, it becomes easier to hold the entire sweep of history in a single quiet thought, not as a sequence of isolated stories, but as a continuous landscape shaped by countless generations. Across deserts, forests, mountains, and coastlines, the remains of past societies settle into the evening light as though returning to the element from which they emerged. Stone cools after the heat of the day, Sand shifts softly under a gentler wind. Vegetation rustles where streets once echoed with footsteps. Nothing announces itself loudly. The transformation is gradual, patient, almost tender. The civilizations explored throughout this long passage did not vanish in identical ways, yet all shared a fundamental truth. They were composed of people living ordinary lives within extraordinary frameworks. Farmers watching the sky for signs of rain, builders measuring foundations carefully to ensure stability, traders calculating distances and risks, parents teaching children how to navigate the world they inherited. These daily actions formed the substance of societies far more than the grand monuments that later drew the attention of historians. When those societies changed or dispersed, the routines ceased and silence settled where activity had once been constant. But silence is not emptiness. It is simply the absence of familiar sounds, replaced by others: wind, water, the quiet movements of animals reclaiming spaces no longer shaped by human presence. Over time, the natural world softens the edges of structures, integrating them back into the environment from which their materials were taken. The empty stone doorway, present throughout this entire narrative as a gentle thread, now stands in the gathering dusk as the final symbol of this integration. In the dim light, its outline is less distinct, merging with shadow till it appears almost like a memory rather than a physical object. It no longer marks only the boundary between interior and exterior, past and present, presence and absence. It becomes a reminder that all boundaries are temporary, subject to the same slow transformations that affect everything else. Imagine standing before it in this quiet hour. The air has cooled, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant vegetation. Somewhere beyond the horizon, lights from modern cities glow, evidence of the current chapter of human history unfolding. Behind you lie countless chapters that have already closed, each one contributing to the conditions that made the present possible.
In this stillness, there is no sense of loss, only continuity. The people who built the vanished civilizations were participants in the same human story that continues today. Their successes and struggles shaped the paths that later generations followed, even when those connections are not immediately visible. Knowledge passed down indirectly, landscapes altered by their hands, cultural patterns adapted and reinterpreted. All of these form a quiet inheritance. Historians often work to recover details, to assign dates and names, to reconstruct events with precision. Yet beyond those efforts lies a broader understanding that does not depend on exact information. It is the awareness that humanity has always been engaged in the process of creating, sustaining, and reshaping communities in response to changing circumstances. Disappearance, in this context, is simply one phase within an ongoing cycle. As the first stars appear overhead, the sense of time deepens further. Those same stars shone above the Indus cities, the temples of Angkor, the terraces of the Andes, the villages of the North Sea coast, and the countless other places visited in this quiet exploration. They witnessed migrations, harvests, celebrations, conflicts, and departures. Their constancy contrasts gently with the impermanence of human arrangements, offering a perspective that is both humbling and reassuring. If this long reflection has carried you toward the edge of sleep, it has done so in the same spirit as the civilizations it described, not with urgency or spectacle, but with patience and steadiness. The past does not demand attention. It waits quietly, ready to be remembered when the mind is calm enough to listen. And so, as night settles fully and the world grows still,
The story of civilizations that vanished without a trace comes to rest in a place of quiet understanding. Nothing has truly disappeared. Every city, every village, every community has left something behind, even if only the subtle shaping of the land or the faint echo of a tradition carried forward unconsciously. The empty stone doorway remains in the darkness, no longer illuminated by sun or twilight, but outlined softly by starlight. It stands open, as it always has, not as an entrance to the past alone, but as a passage within the endless flow of time. Anyone who pauses there can sense the continuity stretching in both directions, backward through the countless generations who have already passed, and forward toward those yet to come. In that calm awareness, the journey gently concludes, not with a final answer, but with a quiet invitation to rest, knowing that the story of humanity continues beyond any single civilization, beyond any single moment, carried onward by the same enduring impulse to live, to adapt, and to leave behind traces for the future to rediscover in the stillness of another night.